The morning I found out my son had emptied my savings account, I was sitting in my cardiologist's waiting room reading a 3-month-old issue of Field and Stream. My phone buzzed. It was an automated text from my bank, a low balance alert. I figured it was some kind of glitch. I had $347,000 in that account. I'd been building it for 31 years. 31 years of working as a structural engineer in Cincinnati, waking up at 5:15 every morning, brown bagging my lunch, driving the same F-150 for 11 years, because it still ran fine and I didn't need anything newer. 31 years of saying not yet to the ski trip my wife kept suggesting, and maybe next year to the lake house we used to look at online on Sunday evenings. We never got that lake house. She passed in 2019 from pancreatic cancer, and after the funeral, when the casseroles stopped coming and the house went quiet in a way I still haven't gotten used to, I told myself the money would be there when I needed it, that I'd figure out what needing it looked like eventually. I walked up to the bank teller that afternoon, expecting to sort out some kind of technical error. Instead, the woman behind the counter pulled up my account, looked at her screen, then looked at me, then looked at her screen again in that way people do when they're trying to buy themselves a second to figure out what to say. The balance was $4,211. I asked her to read it again. She did. I sat down in one of those padded chairs near the door that banks put out so elderly people don't keel over on the floor. I just sat there. The account had been drained over a period of 11 weeks. Transfers, mostly. Some withdrawals. All of them authorized. All of them initiated by someone who had full access to the account. Someone I'd added as a cosigner 2 years earlier, after my heart surgery, when my son had sat across from me at my kitchen table and said, "Dad, you need someone who can handle things if something happens to you." I'd believed him. He was my son. I need to go back a little, because the way I raised him matters to this story. His mother and I had one child. We poured everything into that boy. Good schools, music lessons he quit after 6 weeks, baseball camps, a used car when he turned 17 that I spent 2 weekends restoring. He was never a bad kid, I want to be clear about that. He wasn't cruel or mean-spirited. He was just always a little too comfortable. A little too quick to assume things would work out. When he dropped out of college his junior year, I was disappointed, but I didn't cut him off. When his first business failed, I lent him money. $18,000 that he promised to pay back and never did, though I stopped counting on it after year 3. When he got divorced, I let him move back into the house for 8 months. I cooked for him. I washed his laundry. I told him he'd be okay. What I didn't see, what I kept refusing to see, was that he had learned something from all of it. He had learned that consequences had a way of not quite landing on him, that there was always a soft place to fall, and that soft place was me. When I had the bypass surgery in the spring of 2022, he drove 4 hours to be at the hospital. He sat with me through recovery. He handled the insurance calls and the discharge paperwork, and I was genuinely moved by that. I thought maybe something had shifted in him. When he suggested being added to my bank account so he could keep an eye on things while I was getting back on my feet, it felt like the natural next step. I was 63 years old and had just had someone cut open my chest. My son was offering to help. I said yes. For the first year, as far as I could tell, nothing changed. I didn't watch the account as closely as I should have. I've always handled money carefully, but I'm not someone who checks balances every week, not when things feel stable. I trusted him. That word keeps coming up, and I know how it sounds, but you have to understand that distrust had never been part of how I operated with him. It didn't occur to me to be suspicious of my own son. The transfers started small. I found this out later, after I'd hired a forensic accountant. 300 here, 500 there, spread out enough that they didn't look like theft. They looked like incidental expenses. Utilities, maybe, or some car repair. After the first few months, he got bolder. Transfers of $4,000, $6,000, $8,000. In the final 3 weeks before I found out, he moved $112,000 in 7 transactions. By the time that nurse at the cardiologist's office called my name, and I stood up from that waiting room chair, my retirement account had exactly $4,211 in it. I drove home and sat at my kitchen table, the same table where he had convinced me to add him to the account, and I did not cry. I'm not sure why. Maybe I was in shock. Maybe 31 years of early mornings had given me a certain stubbornness about falling apart. I just sat there with a yellow legal pad and a pen, and I started writing down everything I knew. My son's name, the account number, The dates of the transfers I could remember seeing on my phone, the name of the bank, and at the bottom of the page, in capital letters, I wrote, "Do not call him yet." That felt important. Every instinct I had was telling me to pick up the phone and demand an explanation. But I was 64 years old and I had spent a career solving problems that required patience. Buildings don't go up because someone loses their temper. They go up because someone works the problem. I told myself to work the problem. The next morning I called my bank and told them what I suspected. They flagged the account and began an internal review. That afternoon I called an attorney, someone I'd known professionally for years, a man who handled estate and financial cases, and I told him everything. He listened without interrupting, which I appreciated. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "You have a case, but you need to understand that this will not be fast." I told him I understood. What I found out over the following weeks, through the bank's investigation and through a private investigator my attorney recommended, was worse than I'd imagined. The money hadn't gone to pay off debt or cover some emergency I didn't know about. It had gone to a very specific set of purchases: a new Audi Q8, lease payments on an apartment in Nashville, a city he had apparently relocated to without telling me, restaurant bills, a boat, not a small fishing boat either, but something you'd trailer down to the lake on a holiday weekend to impress people, the kind of thing that cost more new than my first house had. And then I found out about the property. Through the public records, search my investigator ran, we found that my son had purchased a piece of land outside of Franklin, Tennessee, a 2-acre lot with a small house on it, close enough to Nashville to be convenient, far enough out to feel like something. He had paid cash, or rather, he had paid with money that had once been mine. I want to tell you what that felt like because I think it matters. The lake house my wife and I used to look at online, we never bought it. We always said someday. Someday we'd have enough. Someday the timing would be right. Someday we'd slow down enough to actually enjoy it. She died before someday came, and now I was looking at property records for a house my son had bought with my retirement savings. A house he was living in, comfortably, while I had $4,000 in my account and a heart that a surgeon had rerouted 2 years prior. I did not call him. I wrote it down on the legal pad and I underlined it twice. Do not call him. I got a second attorney. I want to be honest about the cost here. By the time I had a lead attorney, a forensic accountant, and a private investigator, I had spent somewhere around $40,000, most of it borrowed against the equity in my house. People hear about legal cases like this and they imagine justice arrives neatly and cheaply. It doesn't. It arrives slowly and it costs something. But I had spent 31 years building something worth protecting, and I intended to protect it. The forensic accountant was a woman about 10 years younger than me, who wore reading glasses on a chain around her neck, and spoke about financial crimes with the same matter-of-fact tone a good mechanic uses to explain what's wrong with your transmission. She traced every transfer, every withdrawal. She built a document that was, by the end, 63 pages long, and accounted for every dollar that had left my account and where it had gone. It was, in a strange way, one of the most thorough things anyone had ever done on my behalf. My attorney filed a civil complaint. The bank completed its investigation and confirmed fraud. My son was served. That was a Tuesday in March. I know it was Tuesday because I had been to the hardware store that morning to pick up weather stripping for the back door, something I'd been meaning to do for months, and I was on my knees by the back door with a utility knife when my attorney called and said, "He's been served." I finished the weather stripping. Then I sat on the back porch with a cup of coffee and looked at the yard my wife had planted 20 years ago. The dogwood was starting to bud. She had loved that tree. On Thursday evening at 11:42 p.m., my phone rang. I looked at the screen. It was my son. I had not blocked his number. I had considered it, but my attorney advised me to keep the line open in case he said something useful. I picked up. He wasn't screaming, exactly, but his voice had that high, tight sound that voices get when someone is trying to control panic and not quite managing it. "Dad. Dad, what is this? What did you do? You're suing me? There are people. There are attorneys. They served me at work, Dad. Do you understand what that means? They served me at my office in front of my colleagues. I let him talk. I let him go for a while. And then I said, 'Son, where do you think the money came from?' 'For the car. For the apartment. For the property in Franklin.' Silence. 'I want you to answer me honestly,' I said. 'Just once. I want you to say it out loud.' He didn't say it. But he stopped talking, and the silence was its own kind of answer. I told him I would see him in court. I told him I hoped he had a good attorney. And then I said something I hadn't planned to say, something that came out quiet and flat, without anger. Your mother would have been devastated. I hung up and went to bed. I slept better than I had in months. The legal process took the better part of a year. There were depositions. There was discovery. My forensic accountant testified. The 63-page document became evidence. My son's attorney, to his credit, was competent, but competence can't do much when the documentation is that thorough. Every transfer had a timestamp. Every withdrawal had a record. Every dollar had a destination. He settled. I won't go into the full details of the settlement, because some of it is still subject to agreement, but I will tell you this. The property in Franklin, Tennessee, the one he had bought with cash, with my cash, 2 acres and a small house outside of Nashville, came back to me as part of the settlement. He had to sign it over. His attorney tried to negotiate a payment plan instead, some arrangement where he'd pay me back over time, and my attorney brought that offer to me in a phone call on a Wednesday afternoon, and I was quiet for a long moment before I said, "No, I want the property." I don't know exactly why I said it that way. Partly it was practical. A payment plan from a man who had already proven he couldn't manage money was not a guarantee of anything. But partly it was something else. He had taken the someday that my wife and I had never gotten to. He had taken the savings that were supposed to be what came after 31 years of doing things right. The least I could do was take the thing he'd bought with it. I drove down to Franklin in late September. My attorney had handled the transfer of title, and there was a property manager who had agreed to meet me there and hand over the keys. She was a local woman, efficient and businesslike, and she walked me through the house without much ceremony, which I appreciated. It was a good house, modest, well-maintained, sitting back from the road with a stand of cedar trees along the south side and a covered porch that faced west. The previous, I suppose I should say the last, occupant had left some furniture behind. A rocking chair on the porch, a kitchen table with 4 chairs, a bookshelf in the back room with a few paperback thrillers, left spine up. I sat down in that rocking chair and looked out at the cedar trees. The late September light was coming in low and orange the way it does in that part of Tennessee. Somewhere behind the tree line a woodpecker was working on something. I could hear it going steadily, patiently, knock after knock. I thought about the years I'd spent saying, "Not yet." I thought about my wife looking at lake houses on her laptop on Sunday evenings while I pretended to read the paper and secretly looked too. I thought about the fact that I was 64 years old and had survived open-heart surgery and my son stealing my life savings in a year of legal proceedings, and I was sitting on a porch watching the light go orange in the cedars. I listed the Audi for sale that same week. The boat, too. Those were part of the settlement recovery as well. What they brought in, combined with the property, came to just under 90% of what had been taken. Not everything. I want to be honest about that. The legal fees and the investigator and the accountant ate into the recovery, and there were costs that couldn't be quantified. The stress, the months of uncertainty, the particular specific grief of realizing your child is capable of something like this. But 90% of something, on a porch, with a cedar tree and a woodpecker, felt like more than I'd had when I was sitting in that bank chair, looking at $4,211. I moved to the Franklin property full-time in November. I brought the rocking chair from my Cincinnati house, the one that had been my wife's, and I put it in the bedroom where it could look out the window at the cedars. I unpacked my tools into the small garage. I started a list of things that needed fixing, the way I always do in a new space, and I worked through it methodically, the way I've always worked through everything. My son and I have not spoken since that phone call in March. I don't know what to say to him, and I'm not sure he knows what to say to me. That grief is its own thing, separate from the money, heavier than the money, and I haven't figured out yet how to carry it. Maybe I won't. Maybe you don't figure that part out. You just get up in the morning and make coffee and go out to the porch and listen to the woodpecker and let time do what time does. What I know is this. I spent 31 years building something, and someone I loved took it from me, and I didn't scream, and I didn't threaten, and I didn't beg. I sat down at a kitchen table with a yellow legal pad, and I worked the problem the way an engineer does, one piece at a time. And in the end, on a covered porch in Franklin, Tennessee, watching the light go low through the cedars, I got to keep most of what I'd built. That's not the ending I would have written if I were writing it, but it's the one I have. And on most mornings, when the air comes through the trees and the coffee is hot and the porch is quiet, it's enough.